We're going to start up the afternoon. Thanks for your attention. Our first speaker of the afternoon, Neil Denari, in addition to, or perhaps because of, being the only speaker of the day possessing a full head of hair, is a Texan. He was born in Fort Worth and obtained his B.Arch at the University of Houston before getting his M.Arch at Harvard's Graduate School of Design. Best known right now for his recently completed HL23, a 14-story condo tower which leans over or hugs to personify the object in a way that Hal was deriding this morning, the High Line in New York. Neil interned after graduation for Aerospatiale Hélicoptère, now Airbus, in Paris. He spent about 5 years after that working in New York for Polshek and Partners while churning out an impressive array of his own speculative work on the side, much of which was published and exhibited, though not all, and I think the all will be finally published in your compendium that's about to come out. Yet another person who's about to publish yet another book, but Neil's monograph will be out soon. Next summer. Neil moved to LA in 1988 to establish his own firm. He was the director of SciArc from 1997 to 2002 and is now a professor at UCLA. Neil's also been a visiting professor at many other schools, including Harvard, Princeton, and the Shibaru Institute of Technology in Tokyo. He's received many accolades, including an Academy Award from the American Academy of Arts and Letters in 2008. There are two aspects of Neil's work that particularly impressed me. First is his ability to move fluidly, glide even, between architecture and industrial design, which is perhaps best illustrated by his very recent design of the new low-cost Japanese airline Peach. Wildly magenta, making our reds and pinks look quite tame. Importantly, Neil doesn't fetishize industrial design. Instead, his practice develops new directions for architecture, learning from the technologies, scales, and dimensions of industrial assembly. Second is his ability to redefine context. In part, this point relates to the previous one in that Neil recognizes that the industrial productive landscape, Boeing 747s, for example, is part of our contemporary architectural context and, in fact, overwhelms most architecture. HL23 is an interesting example of how architecture can engage without either being overpowered by or fetishizing a larger industrial context. Neil's work is at once industrial and technical, at once speculative and built, at once timeless and futuristic. In fact, one can say that he himself is either timeless or out of whack, either of which is quite interesting to me. Our second speaker, Ben van Berkel, founded with Caroline Boss UN Studio in 1988, so the same year that Neil founded his firm, which I find interesting, in Amsterdam. And they've had a prolific practice in Amsterdam since then. What interests me specifically about Ben and UN Studio is their project and their own articulation of that project. Like hawks circling around their prey, they've been honing the terminology that best explains their own practice, but also how they believe one can or should practice in today's postmodern, global, technologically advanced context. Their project is not a style or a technique, but an evolving and precise experiment. While at first they deliberately eschewed the term typology, objecting to its normativity and its association primarily with institutional programs, replacing it with the more practice-tied term model, they've recently come around full circle back to the term type. They speak of a serial typology, where type is no longer a fixed formal, spatial, or organizational system, but rather an evolutionary model, an instrument that evolves across several projects within their practice. Whether the right term is type, model, instrument, or tool, we'll find out soon enough, but I applaud them for trying to find the right term, for realizing that it does matter because therein lies their project, which is not a style or a technique, but an architectural experiment. By openly evolving the terms, the word terms as well as their architectural terms, they turn that experiment into a shared architectural project that we can participate in as colleagues and as users. Their project deliberately and very consciously evolves these models in order to address contemporary architectural problems, and in so doing, they demonstrate that one can practice in a way that's highly specific in regards to each particular project, but that also is generalizable in terms of being a project or maybe an unproject. What I find interesting about the two practices is the number of similarities across these two practices in terms of approach and experiment, and the absolute coincidence of time, and yet they're, I think, completely different approaches from Los Angeles and Amsterdam. We welcome both of them back to the school, actually, which is, I think, just an underscoring of our appreciation of their commitment. So Neil, if you can come to the podium first. Thanks.
Sarah was reminding me, thank you very much, Sarah, for that. And you were reminding me the last time I was here, the projector didn't work, and I had to lecture for 15 minutes with no images, and it reminded me of the days when I used to do amateur stand-up comedy, and it was very frightening. So anyway, I think the premise of the day is really fantastic, and made me think a lot about how we work. You know, I don't know who said it. Maybe it was Bob Somel, maybe it was others who said you don't get any credit for solving problems that you invented, because essentially you go directly into a world of excess. Architects looking for something somewhere else than, in many ways, their own discipline. And yet I had to kind of examine, that motive for our office and what's going on. And I pulled out a term, actually, before Sarah invited me to come, an old term, facticity, that I'm sure after I get through with this, you're just gonna, you're gonna use it, and it's gonna be cool again, because it was it's a 220-year-old word, first used by Kant and Fichte, his contemporary. And in many respects, it's a term that fits perfectly, at least for how we think about how we approach our work. Facticity is both a limitation and a condition of freedom. And when you think about a term that's so open-ended or so ambiguous, on the one hand, to allow you to, let's say, state an architectural project of, let's say, precision, of material factness, of response to program and so forth, but that it's done under not the duress of dogma, but the open-endedness of freedoms that, let's say, we establish. And the question of exploiting freedoms is making sure that they don't become closed dogmatic ideas. For a person, limitations are one's past. Facticity is in terms of philosophy, usually directed toward the subject, toward a person. For the existentialists, for instance, they would say, your past is who you are. The past is a fact, and if you don't live with your past, then you're living an inauthentic life. So on the one hand, the limitation is both the thing that you have to acknowledge. If we just immediately kind of transpose this term to architecture, we could say, and we all know this, that architecture is bound by many limitations, gravity and the program, maybe two, or the two most famous ones. And in many cases, gravity and the program are, depending on, I guess, one's kind of ethos, it would either be something that you try to overcome immediately and sort of get rid of and shatter, and find ways in the freedoms that you're trying to kind of afford yourself a way to get around it. Or you're going to, let's say, obediently respond and clarify and deliver, let's say with no other ambition to problematize that. And in many respects, it's this idea of the limitation and the freedom that we're trying to kind of think about. Let me transpose it one more way, one more type into the nature of problems. Let's say there's two types of problems, no more. And the first one is the functional problem, things that need to be fixed, solutions. On the one hand, we know in architecture it could go back to the program, solve for it, give me 3 bedrooms and 2 bathrooms, no more, no less. Functional problems could be things that culture agrees on, and in architecture, again, it could be, let's say, housing the homeless or making sustainable buildings work in the future. Things that if we're all sort of agreeable, those are good things, and those are things that probably need to be worked on, our sort of versions of medicine, what needs to be fixed. Then there's the disciplinary problem. Things that need to be worked on, which we can call obsessions, and Hal might call them fetishes, or obsessions that essentially drive, let's say, into the ground on the one hand, or into territory for which there's little use value, especially compared to the first type of project, first type of problem, which everybody says, yes, we need to fix. Yes, we need answers. So I guess the thing to kind of lay out on the one hand, going back to solutions to problems that don't exist, I'm going to attempt to try to create value or a certain type of logic for why architects invent problems, or why we invent problems in the face of, let's say, the dramatic complexity that architecture always presents us in a way. And I'm just going to give one example of a disciplinary problem and relate it to the three examples that I'm going to show you in our work. And that example is the shaped canvas from the 1960s. I know it's basically, I could say, well, this is already a sort of curious obsession, but I'm obsessed about what they were obsessed with, or a certain few artists were obsessed with at that time frame. So both of these pieces were done in 1965. Left is Frank Stella and Roy Lichtenstein on the right. And there's a couple of conditions of each one of these pieces that are really pretty interesting, I think especially relevant to the morning's conversation. The pop art project of Lichtenstein, on the one hand, does one thing in distinct opposition, obviously, to the Stella piece, which is it works with a square canvas or a rectangular canvas, and it doesn't, in that sense, reject the pictorial nature of painting over thousands and thousands of years. It does, to many respects, try to change and challenge the nature of painting, obviously, through its technique and through what it represents, kind of in a literal fashion. Culture didn't ask, the bigger culture didn't ask artists to reshape canvases. Artists who were essentially operating in a kind of mode of crisis about where painting would go said, at the very least, we can disfigure the perimeter of the canvas so that the nature of the window or traditional painting would, let's say, disappear. And for Stella, parallel offset lines in 3 or 4 colors in this kind of starburst fashion are pretty interesting. Not only are they loosely related, although it's just my comparison to the striated lines of the Lichtenstein piece, they're both saying completely different things. But the Stella project, which we know as being the sort of ultimate, what you see is what you get painting, there's nothing else going on except the paint on the canvas, and the offset lines dramatize again and again and again and again the shape of the canvas. But of course the critical project is that painting is otherwise dead unless you could change the perimeter of the canvas to get away from, the history of storytelling. Culture didn't ask for it. The artists who were interested in this invented the problem of the end and the exhaustion of the perimeter of the canvas, and made a proposition. Now, of course, we know shaped canvases aren't the paradigm that lasted forever. It actually lasted for 5 or 6 years, and then it was over. Which is a curious case about the nature of the sort of shelf value and shelf life of ideas themselves as they're attempting to overcome or critique paradigms. Now let me indulge you with this quote from Baudrillard. Speaking of old school, it's his first book written in 1967 called The System of Objects. And he starts off with automatism, and let's just say, in the book he's talking about products, because the book is about consumer culture and advertising. and the rise of technology, and you can start a car without having to crank it, and all sorts of other things, push button logic, that was going on in the 1960s, the new space age world. So automatism covers that. Automatism per se is simply a technical deviation. We're already going down a terrible path here. But it opens the door to a whole world of functional delusion, to the entire range of manufactured objects in which a role is played by irrational complexity, obsessive detail, eccentric technicity, or gratuitous formalism. Now, when I read that, and I've read it over and over again, of course I have to ask myself, is that what I do? I guess it is. Oh, now I have to set out basically an argument to legitimate what would, in Baudrillard's very, very withering Marxist critique of consumer society as everything having to do with excess that is beyond the logic of program. In this poly, para, hyper, and metafunctional sphere, the object at its farthest removed from objective determinants is completely taken over by the imaginary. We could substitute obsession, we could substitute fetish, we could substitute anxiety even, because facticity actually represents angst and anxiety at some particular level, which is you're always fighting against the facthood of everything that you're working with. Architects fighting against gravity, architects fighting against program, architects fighting against politics, money, and so forth. It always seems to be about this kind of project of angst. Yet, of course, there's a lot of different expressions, different generations of what that energy might be. So the imaginary, which, of course, by the end of the book, Baudrillard is completely against, as he thinks that the consumed world somehow doesn't have limit, or it's inexhaustible, unlike natural resources. And so the obsession with all of this is problematic, that it never seems to die, that the imaginary seems to kind of reappropriate itself time and time again. Okay. I'm going to show 3 projects, and curiously, they all have to do with windows, and they all have to do with shaped windows. So I want you to keep the shaped canvas in mind in relation to these windows. Because I'm not sure architecture asked for these windows. I'm not sure the clients asked for these windows. The architects asked for these windows. And in that sense, the Kantian sensus communis, we need to wonder whether or not culture wants these windows, and whether culture thinks they're beautiful, or they're good, or they work better than the old ones, or what have you. So that's what we're asking. Problem number 1, the Russian middle class and its new identity. Could there be an aesthetic indifferent to class? Okay. We were one of 4 offices. We were the Weird Ringer office in a competition invited for housing for the middle class 20 kilometers south of St. Petersburg, Russia, on a very, very strange site, basically a lunar site. You can see the first phase, which is already completed, is on the left. And the client, the son of 2 St. Petersburg billionaire bankers, who then decided to put their money into development, put their 35-year-old son in charge of building a new city, ultimately for about 100,000 people on one site. He said, well, we know what traditional forms of identity are for both planning and also for architecture. Let's see what you would do. Of course, that was, we're not going to win the competition straight away. But yet we're dealing with all of the same conditions to make the project real, to make it potentially viable. This is 45,000 people. There's very little commercial. The demands were to put the parking underneath each building and to make a sort of faux city. It's really a kind of drive-in, drive-out suburbia. Most of this is determined and oriented by solar issues. There's very little sun in St. Petersburg. and it's cold, obviously, most of the time. So the site plan has a number of other agendas attached to it, which is trying to break down the linear boulevard, trying to essentially spread the green space out and not centralize it. So in developing essentially a world of 45,000 people, and this was a project not for several architects or one master plan for many architects, this was you do the master plan and you're going to design all the buildings. So straight away, you're trying to think about the issue of diversity. Now, all we said was, and this is the first facade of, I think, 4 that I'm going to show you, of a courtyard building that responds to solar issues. And the one thing we said is no rectangular windows. No rectangular windows. We'll do anything but make rectangular windows. And the reason why is we ascribed the grid. We ascribed the grid as it was built not only in Russian Soviet-era housing, but of course all over the place, that the grid was a sign of efficiency and nothing more. The grid was a solution to the problem of Category 1, but had no imaginary in it. And we said, how can we bring an excess problem, or how can we shift this to a problem, let's say, that might be in Category 1, even though each building is hardcore. There's X number of units, they do X number of things, they deal with 2 hours of sunlight on each surface. But we said no rectangular windows. And of course at that moment, we're kind of asking ourselves, well, is there an aesthetic on the one hand which doesn't necessarily try to critique the banality of the ordinary grid, because grids themselves don't have, they're not as signified as being banal, depends on how it's done, obviously. And would this project become something that wasn't about trying to elevate the middle class or give them a better project, but just simply to give them an aesthetic that was what we hoped would be vital and materialist and incredibly lively in a world that's often dismal and rather gray? Now, one of the things I should say about this project is, with 45,000 people and with the first phase that had already been built, the company would actually set up factories to build all of the components for the buildings. So this wasn't about having to deal with budgets which were only governed by efficient logic and off-the-shelf products, but with things that could be, let's say, customized and new and still beat the price point, let's say. So we had concrete. These are vertical prefabricated metal panels with shaped windows, painted in 2 different tones of white and gray. This is a horizontal grain, which is counterposed against the vertical grain that you see in this particular view. Now let's just look at this view for a second. It looks pretty middle class on the one hand. Boulevards, green spaces. You can see we're trying to hide the parking. And yet we're desperate to do anything possible with the facade, because by the time we deal with resolving Category 1, 45,000 people trying to deal with certain issues of scale, dealing with solar orientation, we bring the problem of the shaped window to this site to try to overcome what we imagine to be choices, limited choices, and a kind of acceptance of the banal because of a class structure. And here we had the one chance, because we could innovate in terms of the way in which buildings could be constructed and change that point of view. Of course, we lost the competition, and we didn't lose the competition because it was too expensive, which is often the case when architects are relegated to second and third place, not efficient enough, and so forth. It was simply that this would be too shocking for the Russian middle class, and somehow we missed the mark completely in our projections about how these windows, as they make new facades and creating different grains and variety, were somehow relegated to a kind of radicalness that was outside of the acceptance of anybody who would be willing to buy a condominium. The school teachers and the firemen and so forth. And it's curious in that sense that either the idea of this as a critical intervention into what otherwise is a historically ordinary and problematic world, those ambitions to change were dismissed, curiously. Along with the housing, we were also asked to design one school. There were 7 schools in this site plan, and there were 4 kindergartens. And surely we thought within the realm of the kindergarten for 4 and 5-year-old kids, for a world that was intended to be and surely should be radically different, than the world inside the grids of this housing, that something in our shaped canvas obsession would change their minds. Even if we lost the project to do this, we were very, very hopeful that this would become a source of curiosity and pride and so forth. So I'm just going to show you a few images of this kindergarten. It's a cast-in-place concrete building. You can see there's a series of flat arches and a kind of seamless wall to column to surface and even to skylight world, where the infill of the glass is constantly sort of shifting and changing. These are like snowflakes. They're always the same but different at the same time. And so, to a certain extent in this kindergarten, and here you see across a couple of interior courtyards, we defied the logic of the climate using high-performance glazing actually to probably bring a kind of California optimism of climate to a world that otherwise is pretty dark and so forth. But what we're looking at in terms of all of these profiles of the window is that the vitality and the shifts. Here's a particularly curious moment of a condition that we know is going to fill up with snow. We've got heaters that are embedded in the concrete to sort of melt it as a kind of index of and recognition of the environment. Become curious moments of vitality, even in their kind of odd binocular-like shape for this environment. So we, of course, weren't given a program to generate oddity in terms of figure and profile of window within a courtyard, but we continued to drive what was at the core of let's say, this ambition to shift perception into the public space, as it were. Problem number 2, mass without massiveness. How to make a house open, yet private. In 2010, we were commissioned by a family of 4, and here they are, at least in silhouette, to give them a world. And of course, when you're designing at this level, and this obviously goes away from the public project into a private project, you're always trying to define emotions and worlds and habits and so forth for something as bespoke as a house. Liberal family, wealthy in the entertainment business, west side of Los Angeles, expensive property, environmentalists, maybe neoliberals, wanted a 5,000 square foot house. Long story short, we talked them into a house of 2,600 feet after I preached on issues of excess, maybe hypocritically, as if you'll look at the house. So I'm willing to come clean here, programs, interests, robots, Gundams, sports, kind of an energy-related house. Here's a diagram that kind of talks about the ways in which each one of the family members relates to one another in local kind of programmatic moments. Here's worlds of greater independence. Now, the big thing about this project is they said, we like modern architecture, but we don't like all the glass. We like the case study stuff, but we would go hire Ray Cappy, the great modern master, to do us one, but we don't want all of that because we feel too open. Usually the typical client in California is saying, I want to live outside, I want total openness, I want a glass pavilion. And that represents let's say, the greatest sense of optimism and care and kind of curiosity about modern architecture. But this family was different. They actually wanted mass. They actually wanted surface. They wanted enclosure, and they wanted at the same time to have a kind of sense of openness and connectivity. So, to a certain extent, this family came to us with their own obsession, but they didn't know how to articulate it. Let's say it's a little bit the same way Hal was talking about the revolutionaries. They want an alternative, but they don't quite know what it is. So, we had to develop a project that was about an appearance for us as architects as being heavy, as being grounded, as being weighted, and having a certain concern for mass. And so when you look at conditions like, let's say, this corner, because obviously there's a fairly robust piece of steel in that corner, because framing on this house is tough and problematic to transfer forces in an earthquake resilient kind of way. So we're already dealing with opacity and surface at some particular level. But when you look at these images, what we're also trying to do, of course, and it's not a new project, is to claim that this is the window, that's the perforation within the wall, and that is the sum total of, let's say, all the gray surface that you see in the elevation. We're actually trying to minimize this white stucco surface, when in fact we know also that the windows are more or less limited within these kind of deep portals. The second thing that we're trying to do with the project is, however, to be sort of straightforward at the same time, and that there wouldn't be any poche in the project. And although we've got rather thick walls, again, because there's columns in the wall that we don't want to express, there's a certain way in which, let's say, this window wants to be flush with this wall. But by the time we essentially look around the building, we see a relationship between depth and opacity, but also on the interior we're going to see a kind of Frank Stella project of what you see is what you get. So for everything that's happening on the exterior, it's still a kind of curiously straightforward ambition to reveal and to be upfront rather than to hide in thick walls. To make this kind of depth would be unthinkable with poche. So this was our response to the idea of how shaping the windows, in this case in a deeply three-dimensional kind of way, would on the one hand solve the problem that the clients came to us that we didn't necessarily invent, but they sought us out because there was already a sense that this was our obsession. So obsession, category 2, collides with the functional project, category 1, to be fixed in this project. Problem 3, how to stand out and fit in at the same time. The project on the High Line, everybody knows the High Line project, and this quirky and unique site for a 14-story condominium. This is on 23rd Street. Immediately in 2005, although the scheme wasn't completely clear, there was one thing that we knew besides the fact that the building would just be a money machine. It's 14 stories. There's basically no space in it. What I mean by no space, I mean it's jammed with floors. It's not a public building. We've got to make the plan work. But at the same time, unlike just an infill building in some regular anonymous site, we were designing a monument and we didn't know it, at least for the first few months. But one thing that we did know from the very beginning was, what other place would an architect have a captive audience? Captive audience, thousands of people approaching your building with no choice about how to read it. In other words, you're on this line. It may be a little bit wiggly, but basically on two sides of the building, on the north and the south, you're staring at an elevation for 10 blocks on either side of it. Nowhere else in New York except the Pan Am building would you have that. So that was obviously up front in our minds, and so in terms of the way in which the design of the building works, besides the fact that our client asked us to make a building that was larger than what the site would allow. Actually, this is a 25-foot wide building. That's what the zoning would allow for our project. It actually goes out to 45 feet at the top and already 32 feet at the bottom. So all of the sort of figural side of the building is in excess of the setback. Of course, it took a year to go through city planning and prove under their rules that there was no problem with light, air, damage to the neighborhood, and so forth. And perhaps quite the opposite was the possibility that the building would be some sort of incredibly positive device for the High Line. Now, it's either a weird curiosity, an aberrant building that is nothing more than a folly. That's, I guess, what the public would judge. Some form of curiosity, or it's a serious piece of architecture. I guess that's what you can decide for yourself. As we come in a little closer, I just want to finally make one point, and it's related to the window project. You see these lines. Now this is ceramic frit in the glass, and behind there are 8-inch steel pipe columns that have intumescent paint. And very early on, we thought of a couple of issues of program for why this ceramic frit would be valuable. And we invented the concern of the public through our own obsession. And the concern for the public was this, that if you're going to make a project that was aberrant and sort of strange, the least you could do is sort of explain what's going on. And the only way to explain what's going on is, on the one hand, explaining that the building doesn't fit the site by the profile, and it seems pretty obvious. And number two, to be able to build that profile, you need to structure it in a particular way. You see the ceramic frit in the glass, and you see the structure here. Now, when you're looking at the building frontally, you actually don't see the structure. And one would ask, why on earth would you put the decal on the glass? Why would you bother with that? In fact, at one point our client asked us that after looking at it for so long, and with the $200,000 price tag on it, said, maybe we should take it off so we can save a little bit of money. And we actually did renderings of it without it. And of course our client is not he might be an aficionado of architecture, but he's definitely not an architect. We took it off and he said, oh, I get it, put it back on. So in some weird way, he actually understood the function of it, even though he couldn't articulate what the function was. And I'll articulate what the function is, and it's hopefully reasonable. The shade, sorry, this is under construction. The shades are going to be down most of the time for a couple of reasons. This is facing south and also for privacy. The shades go in front of the structure. You don't see the structure when you're walking on the High Line based on the way in which the building is inhabited. I said, let's telegraph the structure, and the only way to do it is to produce a doppelganger of the structure in 2D. So this is actually structure. It's a structure that borrows from graphic design, and it's simply an impression of it. Here's the real stuff. And I'll leave it to you as to whether or not that's a kind of bizarre form of dishonesty, or we invented a problem that we thought the public would be concerned by. We had a solution for it, and we installed it into the project. Obviously, these folks don't really care, and maybe that's the point. Thanks very much.